Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th annual Danylo Husar Struk Memorial Lecture. I get a big thrill out of these events for a number of reasons. One, it helps to recall Danylo Struk, who was a colleague, and we instituted this memorial lecture and the Danylo Struk program in Ukrainian literature 17 years ago, right after he died, unexpectedly. And it's been, I can't say it's been a resounding success. Nothing in literature is ever a resounding success. But we've been doing this for a long time, and it's worked. And this lecture series, this is the 17th time we're doing it, and the list of speakers is a list of outstanding figures in Ukrainian literary studies. No less this year than in previous years, but we've attracted some of the best people in the field, and it's been a great pleasure to listen to them. Someday we'll even attract a big audience. But at least we have a very high quality audience. We're waiting. One of these days this room will be too small. But we're not counting on that happening very soon. This year has been a particularly good year for the Struk program in Ukrainian literature. We've had, in addition to the annual lecture, we try to bring people in, and in particular we try to bring in writers. And we've had two this year. We had Sofia Andruchovich back in the fall, and then we had the big star of Ukrainian literature, Zhadan, who was here not too long ago, about a month ago. Right? We also had a couple of other events. We had a couple of book launches in literature or culture generally. Maria Revakovich presented her book on the New York group of poets. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen presented her book on Ukrainian-Canadian anthropological themes. So I'm proud of the work we're doing. We hopefully will do even more, but it's a good program, and we will try to make it even better. Today I have the great pleasure of presenting a very prominent analyst of Ukrainian culture. I'm just going to make sure this is recording. I think it is. Who has a very wide range of expertise. Mykola Riabchuk is, just to read off his official blurb, the Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Political and Nationality Studies in KU. And he is here today largely because he happens to be a Fulbright Fellow at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. this year, which allows us to bring him here. And many of you probably know him as a political analyst. He is certainly one of the most prominent Ukrainian political analysts in the area, particularly of applying political analysis mixed with cultural analysis to the current situation in Ukraine. A whole lot of people are crunching numbers and telling us how people vote in Ukraine, but Mykola Riabchuk is telling us how they understand what they're doing and why. But in addition to his more recent career as a political analyst, Mykola Riabchuk is firmly in the literary world as well. Not only is he an author himself, he actually has a degree from the Gorky Literary Institute in Moscow, which absolutely guarantees he must be a writer, since that's the point of that kind of education. But he has a very storied career in literary management, if we can call it that. He goes back far enough to have been a victim of Soviet repression for his literary activity. He was among the founders of various movements. He was in the group that created the Skrinya Almanac, way back when. Right? He was, for a long time, the editor of Suchasnist. He worked, even before that, he worked for Всесвіт. Then Suchasnist, he worked for Kritika. He has been involved in many of the most important literary projects in contemporary Ukraine. And he continues to be involved in literature. He's even the president of the Ukrainian chapter of the Pen Club. He is active in both literary and political circles. His most recent book, or most prominent recent book, Post-Colonial Syndrome, is a product of that kind of thinking. He's got it in front of him right there. It's been translated into Polish and Hungarian. Not English yet, right? That's coming someday. So I am happy to present to you one of Ukraine's foremost analysts of cultural and political affairs, who will talk to us about literary criticism as sacrilege. And he will explain to you how that happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxim, for such a nice introduction, and thank you, everybody, for coming. But special thanks, of course, to the people who made this event possible, to Oksana Struk, to Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, to Maxim, who manages all these events, and, of course, to Uliana Pasechnik, who hosts me. Thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, I cannot boast to be a close friend of Danylo Struk, even though I would like to be. But I was happy enough to meet him a couple of times and to talk and to have even a couple of lunches. But unfortunately, we have not been close friends. In Ukraine, we say that to become somebody's friend, you have to eat 7 pounds of salt together. We have eaten with Danylo Struk only a crocodile in Florida in restaurants, so, or maybe alligator. So I'm not sure whether American alligator can be substitute for Ukrainian 7 pounds of salt. But anyway, I'm really proud to be here and to deliver, to make this presentation. The title of my presentation actually is not my invention. It comes from Marko Pavlyshyn's article, which was published long ago. It was published in the early 90s, specifically in 1991. It was the last year of the Soviet Union, and it was the height of perestroika. It was the time when hundreds of formally proscribed works came back to the daylight, and old dogmas were challenged, and new ideas and concepts passed through. Marko Pavlyshyn, as a very perspicacious observer of Ukrainian cultural scene, has aptly noticed in that article very interesting phenomenon. Specifically, that a huge amount of new works, names, and interpretation introduced into the cultural realm had not resulted in any serious revisionism and revaluation of old hierarchies. The institution of criticism, Pavlyshyn wrote, is proven able to rehabilitate writers and to incorporate them into the existing canon, but it is proven incapable on the whole of having anyone dropped from the canon. In his view, there were 3 major reasons for the observed situation. Firstly, it was a de facto elimination of the literary criticism as a heuristic, analytical, and conceptualizing activity since the Stalinist times. Its virtual reduction to just two genres of dogmatic hagiography, and political denouncement. And secondly, it was a kind of ghettoization of Soviet writers who were secluded, however comfortably, within the same apartment buildings, same creative resorts, strictly limited number of literary periodicals, and monolithic, hierarchically organized writers' union. So this heavily intertwined and personalized relations heavily influenced their relations, their ability or rather inability to be critical with each other. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, neither people's mentality nor social structure and institutions has changed much. So Marko Pavlyushin concluded, the structure of the inherited Soviet system, especially as reinforced through the institutions of education, has not ceased to emphasize the need for conformity and for participation in a consensual and authoritative system of judgments. Even under glasnost, what has been encouraged has not been an individuality of judgment or a pluralism of critical voices, but the chorus of an opposition which itself lays claim in confrontation with officialdom to new authority. The nascent alternative political establishment is the former literary establishment, for who it is proving just as difficult to distinguish between political and aesthetic approval as it had been for the reactionary establishment of the 1970s. Now, 25 years later, it might be useful to check the reality that has unfolded since then. My primary goal, therefore, is to examine the cultural milieu from the specific perspective of making or remaking the national literary canon, with a closer look at the various factors that influence or even determine the process. Three of them are well known and broadly recognized: literary criticism, academic scholarship, and mass education. There are many more factors, however, that play the role, like Ukrainian writers themselves, the old and new institutions, government policies, international context, and of course the former metropole, which is still dominant, which still is visible, noticeable and influential in kind of neo-colonial context. So my main argument is that Ukrainian society within the past 25 years has been open and pluralistic enough to successfully challenge the old socialist realist canon and largely revise it. At the same time, the process appeared to be much more complex and convoluted than in most post-communist states. It accounts primarily for two reasons. Firstly, the 1991 Ukrainian revolution remained uncompleted. It resulted in the emergence of a hybrid regime that appeared to be quite suitable for old habits, cadres, and institutions. The old canon had not been radically dismantled, but rather gradually eroded under the sheer pressure of time and, so to speak, partisan activity of various actors, rather than any coherent and comprehensive state policy. And secondly, the incompleted decolonization and persistent neo-colonial threat from the former metropole facilitated the revival of the 19th century romantic nationalism with its primordialistic view of the nation and national culture and utilitarian, heavily ideologized approach to literature. In structural terms, this mode of thought is not much different from the communist dogmatism and which dominated before. So little surprise that most custodians, followers, and supporters of socialist realism converted rather unproblematically into some sort of nationalist realism or national realism. Both modes of thought share the same loathe for individualism as opposed to collectivist totality. Both expose the same populism, nativism, and self-styled traditionalism. Both profess the same illiberalism, anti-Occidentalism, and millenarian view of history, with the class teleology in one case and the national teleology in the other. The new generation of followers of Dmytro Dontsov and Stepan Bandera makes a seemingly odd but intrinsically quite natural ideological alliance with the old generation of die-hard critics of the Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism and promoters of Marxist-Leninist creed. For the sake of brevity, I would use here as a focal point only one literary discussion that occurred recently and revealed not so much about literature, but a lot about literary institutions of today's Ukraine, how they evolve, function, and are understood by various actors on the literary scene. The episode that I choose to illustrate my arguments comes from the last year nomination of two George Grabovich's books to the National, until recently State, Prize named after Taras Shevchenko, and the public debate that followed. The Shevchenko Award has been traditionally considered the most prestigious and weighty in Ukraine, not only because of its national status and symbolical reference to the name of the greatest Ukrainian poet, the founding father of the Ukrainian literature, and as many believe, Ukrainian nation. There is also quite a pragmatic reason to yearn for the prize. It is far more weightier in monetary terms than any other literary award in Ukraine. Even today, after the dramatic devaluation of the Ukrainian currency, it still makes up about $10,000, quite a sum in a country with the average salary of $300 a month. So it is very unlikely that the calls to boycott the award as a hopelessly Soviet relic would succeed in the foreseeable future. Some authors state openly that they just need money and do not care about any contentious debates. But most invoke lofty reasons for their dubious stance. First, they accept the award arguably not from the government and president, but from Ukrainian people. And secondly, the sacral name of Shevchenko upon the award makes all the mundane counter-arguments irrelevant. Shortly after the Kuchma-gate, I remember a respectable Ukrainian intellectual boasted in private how he smartly avoided shaking the president's hand when receiving the Shevchenko award. To call the call to boycott the state prize until and unless it is radically reformed emerged in the mid-90s, alongside some other revisionist moves like exodus of a large group of authors from the Unreformed Writers' Union, and their firm boycott of increasingly retrograde, nativist and obscurantist literature na Ukraina. Remarkably, the demands for reform of the post-Soviet literary institutions came not from the former political dissidents, largely co-opted into the old new system for the sake of national unity. The schism came primarily from the younger generation of writers, and not only those who had no chances for the award anyway, but also from the frontrunners like Oksana Zabushko or Yuri Andrukhovich. Both of them made very scornful remarks on the cultural politics in Ukraine and on the practice of state awards in particular. In 1996, Yuri Andrukhovich even publicly withdrew his candidacy from the nomination. The critics' arguments were twofold. First, they contended the Shevchenko Award had been heavily compromised in the past 50 years of its history as being bestowed upon the most odious persons. And secondly, more importantly, they argued that the award is a relic of the totalitarian past insofar as it legitimizes the right of the state to reward and implicitly also to punish the authors. It is not only that the president endorses the decision of the Shevchenko committee by his decree and delivers the award in person in the public ceremony, but also that the government approves the members of the jury, the so-called Shevchenko committee, and nominates its head. Whatever we think of this or that specific award, however, we should understand that all of them are indispensable cultural institutions. No less important than literary journals, organizations, festivals, publishing houses, books, book fairs, and so on. Ideally, they serve not so much writers' material needs or professional ambitions, but primarily literary, cultural process in general. They evoke discussions about the candidates, draw attention to their books, boost the sale, encourage mass periodicals to commission reviews, to interview the authors and critics, and facilitate exchange of readers' opinions in mass media, in social media. Ultimately, they contribute to the reconstruction of the national canon and its continuous interaction with all the strata of the society. Nothing like this is observable in Ukraine, meaning that no nomination to any award causes any significant increase in book sale, number of reviews, or authors' presence in TV and other media. The situation results from two interrelated factors. The first factor is the third world character of the Ukrainian oligarchic capitalism that makes any domestic-oriented production, including book publishing, in most cases unprofitable. This type of economy essentially prioritizes export of raw materials over their deeper, more technological and value-added processing. The Ukrainian book publishing is not a sustainable business, and therefore it appears unable to efficiently support book promotion and advertising, to invigorate literary criticism, cultural periodicals, literary awards, fellowships, and so on. The second factor is a neo-colonial character of the Ukrainian cultural development. It largely preserves the Ukrainian cultural market and the book and media market in particular as a provincial, peripheral part of the greater imperial mall. The predominantly Russian Russophone character of Ukrainian cities means that the most advanced, educated, cultured, prosperous, and influential part of the population, including a great majority of political and virtually all the business elite, are detached from Ukrainian culture and still expose traditional supremacist bias of the presumably advanced Creoles vis-à-vis allegedly backward aborigines. Ukrainian culture, under these circumstances, functions in many terms as a minority culture within the broader imperial framework. Its peripheral and implicitly inferior status is not determined by its presumably lower quality. Usually people who say so have little idea about the facts of this culture, little knowledge. But they just know a priori that aborigines cannot produce anything valuable besides perhaps a picturesque folklore. The inferior status is actually determined by the very fact of comparison, since in the most cases it means seeing the subaltern culture from the point of view of dominant one. The scheme I outlined, of course, is simplified. The Ukrainian reality is much more complex and dynamic. But the model of a Creole state, despite all imprecisions and possible caveats, gives the idea of strong persistence of the colonial legacy. It helps, I believe, to understand why Ukrainian literature in Ukraine functions in many terms as a literature of a large but still marginalized minority. It explains also why the system of literary institutions is so dysfunctional, even though many of them, if taken separately, are very good and vibrant, like a small network of the Year bookstores, for example, or the Lviv Publishers Forum and Literary Festival, or the Arsenal Book Fair, or the Kritika magazine and Courier Krivbasu journal, the Yuri Shevelov Award for the best essays, and the Small Skip competition for young writers. The buoyant phenomena, including superb literary works, do not make up a functional system with the due synergy of all its parts and multi-level interaction with the society. To put it simply, Ukrainian literary institutions do not match Ukrainian literature, either in quality or extent, and therefore do not serve it properly. As a result, Ukrainian literature, however interesting and versatile but by any gauge, is badly underperforming in the society and regretfully underrepresented internationally. It just fails to properly capitalize on its quality either at home or abroad. The recent debate, or actually scandal, provoked by the nomination for the Shevchenko National Prize of two scholarly books by George Grabovich, graphically illustrates the poor plight of Ukrainian literary institutions and more generally of the cultural milieu at large. The event was remarkable in two regards. First, by the sheer fact that any debate aroused at all, because typically all the award nominations in Ukraine pass unnoticed. And secondly, by the apparent fact that it did not intend for any analysis of the nominated works or introduction of their author to the broader audience. Both the works and the name of Professor Grabovich were just a pretext for a purely ideological clash where the main, if not only, goal of the participants was to discredit each other on the political, ideological ground. This is especially true about Grabovich's opponents, who initiated the role in the best traditions of the Soviet denouncements. They accuse the author in nothing less than Ukrainophobia and systemic, long-time observation of Ukrainian literature, defaming its leading figures, Shevchenko in particular, and falsifying and undermining their works. To ground their arguments, they manipulated not only Grabovich's words taken out of the context, but also quotations from other authors who allegedly criticized him. The defenders of Professor Grabovich did not resort to the dirty tactics of their opponents, but their responses were also ideologically charged and transmitted with a similar drum beating, as they also tried to draw public attention to a dangerous, in their view, phenomenon. A large group of Ukrainian and international scholars signed an open letter where they argued that a smear campaign against George Grabovich revealed a deep crisis of Ukrainian cultural institutions and the Shevchenko Award in particular. They called on, quote, all people of honor to condemn such campaigns as unacceptable and destructive to the new Ukrainian society that seeks democratization and riddance of the past totalitarian heritage. And they urged the president to use, quote, a unique chance to begin the awards reform that has been long overdue. The end of quotation. The liberal camp was not unanimously united around this letter. Some pointed out that at an odd inconsistency of Professor Grabovich, who had always been very critical of all the relics of the Sovietism in Ukraine, and Ukrainian humanities in particular, and who suddenly, out of the blue, agreed to run for one of these relics. Some other critics questioned the very logic of the intellectual's appeal to the president. As one of them commented in the web, quotation, politicos and vacos everywhere write, it's informal communication, so I apologize for this specific style. Everywhere write scurrilous crap attacks on respected intellectuals, and other intellectuals sign petitions defending colleagues. But in civilized countries, these are not sent to the head of state. Appeal to the good Tsar or first secretary is a Soviet mindset, even among esteemed foreign-born Ukrainians. Why should a head of state be concerned about what one set of intellectuals whom few outside their circles have heard of say or think about another intellectual whom few outside the circles have as a head of? A fine case of inflated sense of lit-crit self-importance, the end of quotation. In a sense, the author was right, since two different issues were unfortunately mixed together in that letter. The need to defend the freedom of speech and liberal mindset from a sort of Ukrainian Taliban, which should be primarily civil society concern, and the need to reform the state sponsorship of humanities, including the Shevchenko Award, which was, as you know, as I said, granted by the president. So far, the government responded to the appeal in a typically post-Soviet, that is ambiguous and essentially imitative way. They smartly decided not to grant the Shevchenko Award in literature to anybody this year, and they replaced the notorious head of the Shevchenko committee, a rabidly anti-Western and staunchly Sovietophile Boris Oleynik, with a seemingly more progressive and enlightened Yuri Shcherbak. In sum, the Grabovich debate has revealed and embodied two significant peculiarities of post-Soviet Ukraine. One of them was essentially outlined before, as a profound weakness of literary institutions, compounded by general dysfunctionality of the Ukrainian state and supported by Ukraine's colonial legacy and neo-colonial conditions. The second peculiarity has similar roots but broader implications. It reflects the centuries-old rift between the nativists and the westernizers, traditionalists and modernists, conservatives and liberals, between those who prioritize the state, the nation, the community, and those who profess individualism. between those who consider literature as a tool of state-nation building, national education and mobilization, and those who reject any utilitarianism and praise primarily aesthetic values. However naive and redundant the first position might be, it should not be unreservedly dismissed as a mere sign of nationalistic parochialism and obscurantism, even though very often it is what it looks. To properly understand and address the problem, we should be aware of all complexity of Ukraine's national development, of persistent vulnerability of Ukrainian national project, and Ukraine's existential insecurity that has not completely vanished since independence. This makes the ideological conflict described above, conflict between the intrinsically cosmopolitan, individualistic modernity and nativist, collectivistic traditionalism much deeper and salient in Ukraine than elsewhere in the so-called normal nations. Literature has always played an important role in Ukrainian nation building and collaterally in the aforementioned ideological controversy. As in most stateless nations of Eastern Europe, literature in Ukraine had been for nearly 200 years the only national institution that substituted for national schooling, press, politics, government, even the church. This inevitably bestowed upon the writers the status of national prophets and cultural heroes. In the virtual absence of literary criticism and scholarship, the national canon, as an authoritative list of the authors and their works that provide some basis for judgment, standard and criterion, has acquired a rigid hierarchical form defined by publication as iconostasis. The difference is not pictorial but essential. The canon consists of celebrities whose life and work can be analyzed and discussed. The iconostasis consists of saints who should be merely venerated. Or, as a Ukrainian publicist has recently put it in a very indicative form, quote, Husar is more than just a collection of poems. It holds the sacral content of our national existence. This means that we cannot discuss, it was the end of quotation. This means that we cannot discuss, deconstruct and analyze the work of the life of saints, as we do with celebrities, wherever we wish, even in tabloids. The saints are not objects for any debate, but only for worship. The main schism in Christianity emerged actually, as you know, from Protestants who tried to discuss the Bible. The advent of Ukrainian modernism in the early 20th century signaled the first attempts to revise the canon that meant primarily to challenge the iconostasis. The futurists were perhaps the most persistent in this regard. Mikhail Semenko, as you know, even entitled one of his numerous books, Kobzar number 2. But their iconoclastic work was largely facilitated by the general cultural climate of the time. On the one hand, it was the official policy of Ukrainization opportunistically pursued by Bolsheviks throughout the 1920s, the policy that gave Ukrainian intelligentsia some hope for normalization, at least in cultural terms, and therefore made the uncritical veneration of the iconostasis rather obsolete. On the other hand, it was an intense Kulturwerk of many intellectuals, like neoclassics, who elaborated a positive program of canon building without a programmatic and provocative iconoclasm. The Stalinist counter-revolution resulted inter alia in a full restoration of the old populist cultural models, with two significant differences. The traditional iconostasis had to be imbued now with a new ideological meaning and firmly subordinated to a larger, more authoritative Russian iconostasis as its minor provincial replica. The attainment of national independence brought back into the agenda the task of modernization that included also a transformation of the national canon. The obstacles in the process were twofold. On the one hand, it was the unfinished character of the Ukrainian Revolution and incomplete process of national emancipation, decolonization, It supported the feeling of national insecurity and facilitated and legitimized a militant stance against any, however real or imaginary, cultural sacrilege. On the other hand, it was a deeply entrenched tradition of veneration of top persona in the national iconostasis, Taras Shevchenko in particular. It supported rather ritualistic than critical approach and discouraged any revisionism, however justifiable and heuristically productive. As long as Ukrainian culture was stigmatized and language oppressed, any Ukrainian writer could be considered a hero in a way, by the sheer fact of writing in the forbidden or semi-forbidden underdog language. Taras Shevchenko was in particular suitable for the national iconostasis by the virtue of both his poetry and his life. The unique combination of these two factors made him not just a national hero, but also the father, the pater, the creator of Ukrainian nation and its modern literature. George Grabovich has astutely noticed the key features that place Shevchenko unquestionably and uncontestedly on the top of the national iconostasis, his long quotation. Quote, also the phenomenon of the writer as culture hero is found in many societies. No writer in all probability occupies that office so firmly and with so fervent a consensus on the part of his countrymen as does Shevchenko. It is now a commonplace that not only Ukrainian literature but Ukrainian culture and political life and the national renaissance of the 19th century as such were decisively molded by Shevchenko. It has also become clear, however, that his far-reaching influence bespeaks not only the power of his poetry, but also the needs and indeed the political powerlessness of the group for which he became a spokesman. In short, the historical phenomenon that is Shevchenko is also predicated on the cultural readiness of his audience, as well as his ability to resonate with its collective experience, emotions, and expectations. It is precisely this, and not merely his formal and modal recourse to folk and oral poetry, or the fact of his peasant origins, that lends content and credence to the oft-argued notion of his national character. From the cultural anthropological perspective, Shevchenko as a cultural hero meets all the requirements that any mythical hero should meet, or any saint, according to hagiographic writing. We can easily discern in his life story all three stages outlined by Joseph Campbell as mandatory to be qualified. Here are three stages outlined by Joseph Campbell. First of all, there should be separation from the mundane world. Secondly, the hero should acquire some magical power and perform heroic deeds and or miracles. And finally, there should be a triumphant comeback, often posthumous, after the martyrdom in a form of symbolic reburial. In the case of Shevchenko, Grabovich accurately notes, the myth is so deeply internalized and his own experience so interwoven with it that ultimately the poet and the myth are quite inseparable. Shevchenko consistently assumes the role of a prophet who consciously articulates the myth to his people, and both consciously and subconsciously, like a shaman, serves them as mediator between past and present and future, man and God, and ultimately, through his suffering, expiates for the collective sin and curse. Again, the end of quotation. Again, one may notice here that this is fully in line with Joseph Campbell's description of a cultural hero and his primary task of redemption and salvation of his tribe. The national hero, the pater, the prophet, can certainly not be compared to shaman or named a mythmaker. The nativist traditional mentality does not grasp any other notion of nation but a primordial ethnic entity. No other notion of history but a teleological process of nation liberation. No other notion of cultural canon but the iconostasis, with the main prophet on the top and hierarchical rows of saints and priests below. Anything that contradicts these notions is a blasphemy. Any criticism is a sacrilege by its very nature, inasmuch as it is inseparable from analysis, questioning, and problematizing. So, any critical approach to the iconostasis would inevitably evoke protests of true believers who simply do not understand any other discourse besides the prayer. It is not only George Grabovich who went in troubles with his excellent academic studies of Taras Shevchenko, but also Tamara Hundorova and Yaroslav Hryzak, who studied Ivan Franko, or Solomia Pavlichko, who tried to problematize some aspects of biography of Lesia Ukrainka, Olga Kobylyanska, or Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, Yuri Andrukhovich, who created a fictional biography of Bogdan Igor Antonich, Yuri Shevelyov and Ivan Koshelivets, who challenged the sacral figure of Olez Gonchar, Viktor Nebarak and Alexander Boychenko, who questioned artistic validity of Lina Kostenko's novel, and many, many more. All the critical writing is important for our knowledge and mental health. But we should not harbor any illusion about our ability to influence the people who hold the mythical view of the nation, the history, or the cultural canon cast as iconostasis. The mythical thought operates with a different logic and is usually immune to rational arguments. We cannot win on the territory of myth, but we should do our best to defend our own territory. This means primarily our institutions, our critical skills, and of course our system of education, which should be more open-minded and less dogmatic and hierarchical. My recipe, or perhaps conclusion, is simple. We should not destroy the iconostasis insofar as there are people who worship it. We should merely set our canon apart and clearly segregate it from the cultural shrine, exactly as the church is separated from the state in modern secularized societies. And finally, there can be not only one Shevchenko in the canon. In the iconostasis, there is only one possible image of Shevchenko. But in the canon, there could be different Shevchenkos, and the more the better. And at the end, I'd like to show you a couple of illustrations. Shevchenko can be like this, and can be like this, and can be like this, and like this. And this is also Shevchenko. Canon can accept everything. Canon is endless and limitless. Thank you for your attention.